welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this Microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Biographical Encyclopedia, Volume 1, and this article is entitled Taylor, John. So this one is actually on John Taylor. We have done one on John W. Taylor, who was his son. But John Taylor should be relatively well known. I sincerely hope so. But just to recap quickly, a few highlights, I would say. He was born in England. He moved to Canada when he was a child, I believe. And then he was converted in Canada and then came to Nauvoo, if I'm not mistaken. Or was it Ohio at the time? I can't remember, but one of those. And I believe he was one of the original 12 that was called. Let's see, what else? He went to England on a mission, where he converted his wife's family, the Cannons. And so George Q. Cannon is actually his nephew, I believe, and by marriage. And he also was very prominent in the church during the martyrdom, because he was one of the 4 people in the room at the time. The people in the room were Joseph Smith Jr., Hiram Smith, Willard Richards, and John Taylor. John Taylor was shot several times. Willard Richards got passed with only a bruise or 2. He didn't get shot at all, but John Taylor got shot several times. I think it was four times, and one of them that probably would have killed him ended up hitting his pocket watch and saved his life. So that was considered a miracle. But not to forget that he was in the room with Willard Richards, who was a medical doctor, so that did help as well. I'm just saying. He survived. The Smith brothers were both killed. But it was kind of a miracle that Willard Richards and John Taylor survived it, and they both lived to tell their tale. Yeah, we have the most accurate description, I believe, from Willard Richards, but John Taylor was able to express what happened as well to a certain extent. But I believe that he rolled under the bed while they were still shooting, and he was wounded, and that's what ended up saving his life as well, is that he kind of hid himself so he wasn't as easy a target to hit. And then he was also quite prominent in the Exodus, in the aftermath of the martyrdom, and moving to Salt Lake, and then he did kind of apostolic things, and he was president of the Quorum. Oh yeah, they restructured the Quorum of the 12. So it was actually Orson Pratt who was the president of the Quorum for many, many years, and would have been the next president of the church, except that Brigham Young reordered the 12 by seniority. They were originally put in list of age in the original 12, but then Orson Pratt spent a couple of months. It wasn't a long time, but it was a couple of months where he wasn't sure if he believed it, and he was removed from the quorum briefly. And when he came back, he was originally put back in the order where he was from, and Brigham Young felt that that's not really fair, and that he should be in the order of when he came back instead. And so they reshuffled everything, and they put him lower down, which ended up making John Taylor the next president of the church. But he wouldn't have been if they hadn't done that. And that was also later than I thought it was originally. I've heard the story before, and I was thinking, when was that? 1850s, maybe 60s? No, it was 1875, and that was shortly before Brigham Young's death in 1877. So I'm not sure exactly what spurred that on to, what caused that to be a thing. It made me wonder about that, but because of that, so just focusing on John Taylor became then president of the Quorum of the 12. And then when Brigham Young passed away, he was president of the church. And he was then sustained, he reorganized the first presidency then, I think it was 4 years later. Anyways, So that's really interesting. I think it was 1880? It was something like that. I'll have to look it up. But they'll probably say, actually, in the article. But yeah, so that's like mainly what I know about John Taylor. The other thing is when the government put out the Edmunds Act, he went into hiding. And so the last handful of years, I'd say maybe 4 years of his presidency, he was in hiding and didn't actually meet with the saints. So he didn't appear personally in General Conference at that time. He did write epistles, though, which we still have today. Anyways, that you might find that interesting. As far as his character goes, I don't know if I know that much about his character as a person. And I, challenge you, what do you know about his character? So it's like, you should know. Maybe I should know. But I can't think of anything like super prominent off the top of my head, but anyways, but those are like the main highlights that I know about him. And so yeah, let's take a look at the article, and then we can fact check it afterwards. All right, Taylor, John, third president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, was a son of James and Agnes Taylor, and was born November 1st, 1808, at Millenthrop, Westmoreland County, England. His parents owned a small estate in the village of Hale, and in that county. They were members of the Church of England, and he was brought up in the doctrines of that church until he was about 15 years old. He then joined the Methodists and was soon after appointed a local preacher, and continued as such until he left England about the year 1828. What does that say? 1822 or 23? Or does it say... Hang on. How old would he have been? 1828, he would have been 20. He was older than 15. 18... I can't really read it. So I'm not sure what it's supposed to say. I was thinking 28 and 29. We'll have to fact check that. Yeah, I'm not sure what year that is. 1820 something. His father's family had left about 2 years previously and gone to the neighborhood and city of Toronto, Upper Canada. After a short residence in New York, Brooklyn, and Albany, he visited his parents in Canada and took up his residence at Toronto. At that city, he married Miss Leonora Cannon, daughter of Captain Cannon of the Isle of Man, who was a member of the Methodist Society to which John Taylor had attached himself on his arrival at Toronto. Here he united with a few sincere and well-educated gentlemen in the search of the Scriptures, some of whom belonged to the Methodist Society. In the course of their researches, they became convinced of many important truths, such as the gathering of Israel, the restoration of the 10 tribes, and the personal reign of Jesus on earth. They also believed in the necessity of revelation, of men being called of God to preach as they were formerly, of the gifts of prophecy, tongues, healings, and gifts of the Holy Ghost. They came to the conclusion that the churches of the day had departed from the order of God, and were consequently corrupt and fallen, and that if the Bible was true, the religions of the day were false. With these convictions, they fasted and prayed much, that if God had a church on the earth, he would send a messenger unto them. Wow. That takes a lot of character to do that. So I can already list among his character traits is a very strong belief in what is right. A willingness to be corrected, yeah? That's not an easy thing for an adult to read about something in the Scriptures and be convinced that, oh, actually, I'm wrong. Being convinced that you were wrong is actually a big deal. John Taylor heard, investigated, and rejected Irvingism, and shortly after was waited upon by Elder Parley P. Pratt with a letter of introduction from a merchant of their mutual acquaintance. Having heard many of the stories current about the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, he received Elder Pratt cautiously. After a rigid scrutiny, however, he and several of his friends believed the doctrines laid before them and were baptized in 1836. Taylor was ordained an elder by Elder Pratt, and was shortly after set apart by Elders Pratt and Orson Hyde as presiding elder in Upper Canada. During a visit of Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Thomas B. Marsh, the latter then being president of the Quorum of the 12, to Toronto in 1837, Elder Taylor was ordained a high priest under their hands. He paid several visits to the temple at Kirtland, Ohio, and was Joseph Smith's guest while there. during the Great Apostasy of 1837, when many leading men were turned away and became so embittered against the prophet that the lives of men who defended him were endangered. Elder John Taylor stood up boldly in the Kirtland Temple and in the midst of foes, and with that eloquent power which came from God and which ever characterized Elder Taylor's speech, declared that Joseph Smith was a prophet of the living God, and had not fallen as alleged by the apostates. He was equally diligent in private conversation, in maintaining the integrity of the prophet Joseph, and spreading the gospel among the people. Okay, yeah, that's amazing. Like, he had he had a testimony, and he was not going to deny it. Like, that is quite admirable. There's a picture. It's very grainy and difficult to see. One thing that always struck me of pictures of him is that the sides of his mouth turned up, which most people don't. Yeah, most people, when you smile, that's either goes straight or has a very gentle upward motion, but the sides, the very ends of your mouth going up is not common. So I kind of find it that a distinctive characteristic of his pictures. It makes him look kind of happy all the time, like he has a little secret happy thought, you know. I don't know, I kind of like it. I wish I had that. From Kirtland, he removed to Missouri, joining the body of the church at Far West in 1838. In his migration, he preached the gospel on the way and organized a branch of the church near Indianapolis, Indiana. Before reaching Far West, he and a little company of 24 people encountered a mob led by two ministers, Abbot Hancock, a Baptist, and Sachiel Woods, a Presbyterian. July 8, 1838, the Lord by revelation called Elder Taylor to the apostleship, to fill the vacancy occasioned by the fall of John F. Boynton. So he wasn't one of the original 12. Okay, my bad. I apologize. I was about to say, I feel like the timeline's off, because I believe the first 12 were called in 1835 or 6. Was it 35 or 6? It was one of those. Okay, it makes sense. So he wasn't one of the original 12. That's crazy. At a conference in Far West, October 5, 1838, he was sustained by a vote of the saints and ordained an apostle, December 19, 1838, by apostles Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. Okay. Elder Taylor entered immediately upon the duties of his new calling, and, as in all previous callings, soon proved himself truly an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ. While a resident of Missouri, he shared in all the persecutions heaped upon the saints. He was so bold and powerful in his defense of their rights, and so terrible in his denunciations of the wicked, that he was designated the Champion of Right. And this title was ever after accorded him by the Latter-day Saints. That's a lovely title, yeah? I really like that. Imagine if somebody called you that. Be like, you are a champion of right. I love that. While Joseph and Hiram Smith were imprisoned in Missouri, Elder Taylor paid them several visits. He was selected by the Saints of Caldwell County, one of a committee, to draft a memorial to the legislature of Missouri. A memorial? What? Setting forth the persecutions and asking that body for a redress of the wrongs imposed upon them. Well, yeah, but a memorial? I wouldn't call it a memorial, but okay, if that's what you want to call it. Himself and Bishop Partridge were also appointed to write a petition to the general government. Elder Taylor was among the number who, after the expulsion of the saints from Missouri, returned to Far West to fulfill a revelation given July 8, 1838, that the 12 were to take their departure for their mission to Europe, April 26, 1839, from the temple grounds at Far West. The enemy, having learned of this revelation, swore that it should not be verified. They were baffled, however. The brethren arrived on the spot soon after midnight, held a conference, excommunicated a number of persons, and ordained Wilford Woodruff and George A. Smith to the apostleship. I love that they did this at midnight. I can just picture it. On the 8th of August, Elder Taylor left Nauvoo for England. He was sick for 11 weeks on the way. Oh, sounds great. He left his family in the old military barracks at Montrose, Iowa, in very poor circumstances. Most of the 12 and many of the saints were sick, having just passed through the persecutions and hardships attending their residence in and exodus from Missouri. Elder Taylor was a man of great faith in God, and believed thoroughly in preaching the gospel without purse or scrip. When traveling to a certain destination, if he had but a pittance, he would purchase with that transportation in the best conveyances available, thus placing himself among the best educated people in his travels. That's an interesting strategy. It's like I only have like $5, but you know what? I'm gonna rent a coach, and I'm gonna go by coach, and that way I will hopefully meet with people who have money. That's so funny. I wouldn't have thought of that, but I mean, if it works, it works, right? When his means were exhausted with an inexhaustible store of faith, he would stop and preach the gospel. The Lord would raise up friends who would give him money with which he would proceed on his journey. In doing this, he would never ask a human being for help. But he did ask for help because otherwise he wouldn't have gotten it. I'm very confused by that statement. The Lord would raise up friends who would give him money with which he would proceed on his journey. Like, did they randomly give him money? Because I'm guessing that he asked for it. Saying that he never asked is... that sounds like it's not true. I'm just saying. He asked the Lord. Well, yeah, that's what you do. And his prayers never went unanswered. I think that this is the author saying that. Maybe he thinks that he or she, like, it's just, stereotypical. This person, would say something like that. In doing this, he would never ask a human being for help? Really? Okay. You can't travel without purse or scrip and never ask for anything. I'm just saying. Okay. When they were about to sail from New York to Liverpool, he and 2 other brethren were almost destitute of means, not having sufficient to pay 1 passage, much less 3. Notwithstanding their predicament, a very short time before the vessel was to sail, Elder Taylor told one of his companions to go and engage passage for all 3 to Liverpool. His fellow laborers were nonplussed and asked where on earth they would get means in so short a time. Elder Taylor answered that there was plenty of means in the world and that the Lord would send them enough before the vessel sailed to pay their way. Okay, well, that is showing a lot of faith, but, like, I understand the other people's, like, concern. His words were most remarkably fulfilled. He asked no person for money, and yet immediately after he made the prediction, one after another came to them and proffered assistance until enough was provided to meet their expenses to Liverpool. It's really, like, that's so random. He arrived in Liverpool January 11th, 1840, and immediately commenced his missionary work, preaching, baptizing, organizing branches, and with his brethren regulating the church throughout the British Isles. He introduced the gospel into Ireland and to the Isle of Man, extending his labors into Scotland. He published several tracts, setting forth principles of the gospel and refuting falsehoods. Okay, he seems very concerned about correctness, yeah? So, I do appreciate that. He corrected the proof sheets of the Book of Mormon and, with President Young and Elder Parley P. Bratt, prepared and published the first edition of the Latter-day Saints hymn book. While laboring on the Isle of Man, he had secured the printing of some tracts, which he wrote in reply to the falsehoods circulating by ministers and other regarding the character and doctrines taught by the prophet Joseph Smith. When the tracts were ready, the printer would not deliver them until every penny was paid, which was due him. Elder Taylor did not have sufficient to meet the demand, and being very anxious to obtain the tracts, went immediately into a private room, and kneeling down, told the Lord in plain simplicity exactly how much he needed to pay for the matter he had published, in defense of his cause. In a few minutes after the prayer was offered, a young man came to the door, and upon being invited to enter, handed Elder Taylor an envelope, and walked out. The young man was unknown to him. The envelope contained some money and a little note which read, "The laborer is worthy of his hire," and no signature was placed thereon. It got an anonymous donation. That's interesting. In a few minutes later, I hate it when they do stuff like this. It's either a few minutes later or in a few minutes. Yeah? Okay. In a few minutes later, a poor woman engaged as a fish vendor came to the house and offered a little money to assist him in his ministerial labors. He told her that there was plenty of money in the world and he did not wish to take her money, because he knew she was poor, yeah? She was trying to be kind to her. She insisted that the Lord would bless her the more, and she would be happier if he would accept it, whereupon he received the offering, and to his surprise, the poor woman's mite, added to what the young man had given him, made exactly the amount sufficient to pay the printer the balance due him. That is impressive. Like, those are pretty cool stories. After a very active and successful mission, he returned to America, arriving in Nauvoo, July 1st, 1841. Upon his arrival home, he found his wife very near death, being seriously ill. He called to his aid about 20 elders. They administered and prayed for her, and she was restored to health. Well, I'm glad to hear it, but that's scary. In October 1841, John Taylor and Elias Higbee were appointed to committee to petition Congress for a redress of the wrongs heaped upon the saints in Missouri. He was also appointed by the prophet to present the petition. Elder Taylor edited the last 3 volumes of the Times and Seasons by appointment of the prophet. Oh yeah, I forgot he worked in publication of newspapers or something like that, yeah? Something along those lines, yeah? He also edited and published the Nauvoo Neighbor, as well as attending to his high calling in the apostleship. He was a city councilman, one of the regents of the university, and judge advocate of the Nauvoo Legion, all of which he filled with ability and distinction. Okay, cool. Elder Taylor was very firmly attached to the prophet Joseph Smith. He often attended him in scenes of persecution and trial. When Joseph and Hiram were taken to Carthage and lodged in jail on false charges, and promised by the governor of the state protection from mob violence and a fair trial, Elders John Taylor and Willard Richards accompanied them as friends, and were in the prison when the awful tragedy took place which resulted in the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Just before the assault made upon the prisoners, Elder Taylor sang the hymn, "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief." Yeah, he did tell that story, yeah? If you don't know the song, it's a very poignant song where it's about how no matter any time that you are giving service to someone else, no matter how poor of service or how poor the person is you're helping, you're only helping Jesus Christ. Yeah? And so it's like, a poor wayfaring man of grief hath often crossed me on my way. Yeah, it's a very poignant song. And it's really beautiful, but it really, reminds you that what you're doing is for Jesus and it's not for the world, By request of Hiram Smith, he sang it a second time, though he expressed himself as not feeling in a very favorable mood to sing. Between 4 and 5 o'clock p.m., June 27th, 1844, an armed mob rushed up the stairs of Carthage jail leading to the apartment where the brethren were confined. They shot through the door, and a ball pierced the face of Patriarch Hiram Smith. While the mobbers were forcing the door open and pushing their guns through the opening, Elder Richards held the door the best he could, while Elder Taylor parried their guns off with his walking cane. Of a sudden, the prophet Joseph sprang to the window and leaped out. His motive in doing this could not have been to save his own life, for he sprang into the open fire of his enemies. It must have been, as believed by Elders Taylor and Richards, to save the lives of the 2 last-named brethren by calling the attention of the mob from the inside to the outside of the building. His action had the desired effect, for instantly the mob rushed from the stairway to the jail to the ground below, and concentrated their murderous fury upon the prophet as he fell a martyr by the curb of the old well by the side of Carthage jail. Elder Taylor ran to the window and was shot in and near the thigh with 4 balls. He was about to fall out of the window when a bullet struck the watch in his vest pocket and forced him back. He fell upon the floor, not knowing at first what had forced him back, and thus providentially saved his life. Elder Richards, who escaped unhurt, he was behind the door, dragged him to a small room and covered him with an old bed. The mob soon dispersed in confusion, and as soon as convenient thereafter, Elder Taylor was removed to Nauvoo, where he recovered, and carried 1 or more bullets to his grave 43 years later. Yeah, that's very detailed. I didn't realize they were going to go into that much detail, but yeah. Crazy, right? The watch stopped the bullet. It's crazy. He was a man of wonderful vitality and nerve, bearing all physical pains, as he did trials and tribulations of another kind with fortitude unexcelled. Upon his restoration to health, he resumed the performance of his duties, and was one with President Young and his brethren of the 12 Apostles in presiding over the church. He helped the saints in their troubles by every means in his power, assisted in the completion of the Nauvoo Temple, and suffered the trials of another great exodus when the saints were driven from their homes in Nauvoo. He journeyed with the first company of the brethren to winter quarters, assisted in organizing the Mormon battalion, and was from this point called with Elders Orson Hyde and Bartley P. Pratt on a mission to Great Britain. He responded cheerfully, again leaving his family in the wilderness in tents and wagons. He arrived in England October 3rd, 1846, and performed an excellent work, in company with his associates, regulating the affairs of the mission. He returned in the following spring and had charge of a large company of British saints, which entered Salt Lake Valley in the fall of 1847. Yeah, one of the first pioneers, yeah? He now spent 2 years in Salt Lake Valley and was active in founding and building Salt Lake City. He was ingenious in mechanism and withal truly a philosopher under all circumstances. He built one of the first sawmills in Utah and worked in it himself. March 12, 1849, he was chosen one of the associate judges of the provincial state of Deseret. I didn't know he worked as a judge. Cool. In October 1849, he was called on a mission to France. Oh yeah, I do remember this, which he filled with marked ability and success. Upon his arrival in Boulogne, 1850, he was challenged to a discussion with several clergymen, and proceedings of which were published in a pamphlet form in Liverpool and subsequently in Orson Pratt's works. His opponents found themselves utterly powerless to meet him upon scriptural or reasonable grounds, and speedily resorted to subterfuges, lying, and slanderous reports, all of which were refuted in a masterly manner by Elder Taylor. During his mission, the Book of Mormon was translated into French and German under his direction. Yeah, he didn't translate it himself, but he did make sure it got translated, yeah? The latter being published in Hamburg, where he introduced the gospel. He also edited and published in France a monthly paper called L'Étoile du Désert, and in Germany a periodical called Zion's Panier. I'm not familiar with that one actually, but like L'Étoile du Désert, that means the Star of Deseret, and I do like that. So I think that's kind of the early star. Well, they had the Millennial Star from England, so I guess it was probably called that because of it, yeah. During his labors, several branches of the church were organized in France. He also wrote while upon this mission, and published it after his return. The sublime treatise entitled The Government of God. After his return to Salt Lake Valley, August 20th, 1852, he labored with his hands and traveled much, preaching the gospel among the saints. In 1854, he was elected a member of the Territorial Legislative Council, but subsequently resigned this position to fill a mission in New York and to preside over the church in the eastern states. Cool. At that particular time, heavy attacks were being made upon the Latter-day Saints through the press. Elder Taylor published a paper called The Mormon in New York City, establishing his headquarters near the office of the noted writer and editor James Gordon Bennett, to whose attacks Elder Taylor replied in such a vigorous manner as to surprise the anti-Mormon element in that city. His arguments were unanswerable, and as usual, the opponents of the truth resorted to falsehood and buffoonery. He continued the Mormon until 1857, when he was called home on account of the threatened war against the Saints under the administration of President Buchanan. 1857. Okay, that's the Mormon War. Yeah. During the times and circumstances leading to the action of the government in sending an army to Utah, Elder Taylor was active and fearless in defending the rights of the saints and denouncing the preachers and politicians who were industriously circulating falsehoods against the saints. His replies to Vice President Schuyler Colfax's ungentlemanly and unwarranted attacks upon the saints exhibit the fearless character of the man. Yeah, he sounds like he was fearless, as well as the clearness of his mind in penetrating the right and wrong side of every proposition under consideration. He was very active in his efforts to secure the administration of the state of Deseret into the Union. It was upon his return from the publication of The Mormon that President Young designated Elder Taylor as the best editor of a paper among the Latter-day Saints. Wow, thanks. I don't know if he was expecting that. From this time on, for many years, his time was occupied in traveling, preaching, organizing, and regulating the church in the various settlements of the saints. He was many times a member of the Utah legislature and Speaker of the House. As a legislator, he showed marked ability. He also served as a probate judge of Utah County. He was present at the dedication of the St. George Temple, and the first built in Utah. He took part with President Young in the organization of the Stakes of Zion. At the death of President Young in 1877, Elder Taylor was president of the 12 Apostles, and in October 1880 was sustained as president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as prophet, seer, and revelator to the church and all the world. Apostles George Q. Cannon and Joseph F. Smith were chosen as his counselors. During the 33 years the saints that lived in Utah, many had been immigrated from distant countries by the Perpetual Immigration Fund. Okay, sorry, it was strangely worded. I wasn't following it for a second. And many of them were very much in debt to that fund, yeah. The year 1880 being the 50th and Jubilee year since the organization of the church, President Taylor was moved upon to forgive the people their debts to this fund, and thus, as in olden times, make the captive free. He didn't forgive it all, though. It was about 50%, I believe. This was hailed with delight by the saints and is remembered by the grateful with a sense of love and esteem toward President John Taylor. President Taylor presided over the church with dignity and ability. He traveled and visited the saints as far as circumstances would permit. When the crusade against plural marriage came to be waged with bitterness under the rule of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, President Taylor, to prevent trouble and to place himself beyond the possibility of prosecution for an infraction of the law, lived in the Gardow House, having for housekeeper his venerable sister, Agnes Schwartz, while all his families occupied their own homes. He was a just man. Okay, random sentence out of nowhere. Yet notwithstanding his observance of the law, his enemies were determined to arrest him, and if possible, precipitate an eruption, which would give them a pretense for still stronger measures to oppress the saints. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. So he was afraid that if he were arrested, that the people in the church would kind of rise up and like try to overthrow the government. And so he was trying not to allow that to happen. Okay. Interesting that they knew exactly where he was, though. I thought that he was literally in hiding and nobody knew where he was. But apparently that was pretty well known. Upon his return from a trip to Arizona and California, he appeared in the large tabernacle February 1st, 1884, and preached his last public discourse in that building. It was a powerful address, exhorting the saints to faithfulness and forbearance, long-suffering and charity in all their trials. From this time on until his decease, he lived in exile, attending, however, from his place of seclusion by letters, epistles, and otherwise to his public duties. During his exile, one of his wives died after a season of illness. During her sickness, he was prevented from seeing her, as her home was closely watched by miserable spotters, whose characters was as far beneath that of President Taylor as his slough of corruption is beneath the glittering rays of the celestial sun. Wow, author, that was a touch biased. I get where you're coming from, but, you know, you didn't have to go that far. Being denied necessary exercise to which he was accustomed, he became enfeebled in body and his life shortened. He died in exile, July 25th, 1887, in Kaysville, Davis County, Utah. Truly a double martyr. How do you know his life was shortened? Like, could you say that definitively? I don't know. It seems a little strange. Like, yeah, it's not great for you to not get exercise, but, like, would that shorten your life when you're already in your 80s? I'm just asking. It's a question mark. I'm not a doctor, so anybody who knows more than me, which is probably a lot of you, go ahead and chime in. All right. His life was shortened by exile from home under the oppression of unjust men and measures. During the life of President Taylor, he traveled thousands of miles for the gospel's sake without purse or scrip, baptized many people, organized numerous branches of the church, published many tracts, and several large works introduced the gospel to new countries. He was the author of many choice hymns and poems. He received many revelations to guide him in his duties, as well as being a constant medium of inspiration, and received several revelations which were written for the guidance of the church. Before the prophet of Joseph was martyred, he said to President Taylor, "Elder Taylor, you have received the Holy Spirit. If you heed his teachings, the same will become within you a constant stream of revelation." Well, that's lovely. There's a picture, again, this one you're probably slightly more familiar with, the side view. Looks a little bit more like himself, yeah. He still has the turned up smile, though. It's really cute, you know. Anyways, it's a blurry picture, as most of these are. Those who know what revelation is and knew President John Taylor know that the prophet's words were literally verified. Among the striking prophecies uttered by Elder Taylor was one concerning Governor Ford of Illinois, who had virtually betrayed Joseph Smith into the hands of a howling mob. President Taylor prophesied that Governor Ford would live until the flesh had well nigh withered from his bones, that he would lose his property and die a pauper, the subject of charity. A non-Mormon lady who heard this prophecy also attended the funeral of Governor Ford, testified, as did all facts connected with the subsequent life, death, and burial of Thomas Ford, that President Taylor's prediction was fulfilled to the very letter. That's crazy. President Taylor was a man of fine appearance. He stood about 6 feet high. His countenance was heavenly, and whosoever went into his presence, either in private or in public, felt intuitively that he was in the presence of a great man, a man of honor and merit. His abilities were varied, and though preeminently spiritual, he had a strong liking for good literature. Yeah, sounded like it. In pioneer, Exodus life, across the weary plains afoot, and with teams under trying ordeals as in all other experiences, John Taylor was master of the situation. He cheered the saints by faith-promoting anecdotes of past experience and history, with prophetic inspiration, pointed them to a future of long respite from mob violence. He could compose and sing hymns and pleasant songs with high moral sentiment embodied in them. There was nothing in his nature and sentiments of a pettish or groveling character. He spurned every sentiment that was low or dishonorable in thought, word, or deed. His language and manner of address was always chaste and dignified to the very extreme. He left a noble family of wives, sons, and daughters, to whom he bequeathed, as a rich legacy, his noble virtues of honor, self-denial, integrity, purity, faith, and devotion to God. He lived, labored, and died the perfect exemplification of his favorite motto, the kingdom of God or nothing. Partly by Matthias F. Cowley. Partly, huh? What does that mean? I don't know what that means. Okay. Yeah, John Taylor. Most of the details were things that are pretty well known, yeah? So, I don't really feel like we need to belabor the point very much. But I do feel like there were a few things in there that points a little bit more towards his character as a person, yeah? Now, the Wikipedia article is a bit long. I don't really want to read all of it. So I'm going to try and focus on things that we didn't cover in this article, okay? So we'll read the very beginning and then skip around a bit. So John Taylor, 1st November 1808 to 25 July 1887, was an English-born religious leader who served as the third president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Church, from 1880 to 1887. He is the first and so far only president of the LDS Church to have been born outside the United States. Yeah, I heard that somewhere. I don't think it's terribly relevant, but okay. Early life. I feel like that was kind of covered. Like he, joined Methodist Church and moved to Toronto. Anyway. Early stuff, Nauvoo. First Nauvoo neighbor. The martyrdom, yeah? There's a picture of his watch. I'll put it up here. The pocket watch worn by John Taylor during the martyrdom of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. And it still has a bullet hole in it. Yes, it does. It's a pretty small one, though. I feel like the bullet didn't completely penetrate, yeah? But it did break the watch. Migration is... Okay, government positions. Mission president. Well, let's read a little bit about mission president, because I feel like that would be something not everybody knew about when he was in Europe, yeah? So Taylor served as president of 2 missions of the LDS Church. In 1849, he traveled east on his way to begin missionary work in France, stopping at various waypoints in the homes of Mormon pioneers still making their way to the Salt Lake Valley. Taylor was the first church mission president in France. While in France, Taylor published a monthly newspaper called L'Étoile du Désiré, with the help of Louis A. Bertrand. He also supervised missionary work in Germany, but did not go himself to any of the countries that would later form Germany. See, and they said something about Hamburg, but I think that was because the German translation of the Book of Mormon was printed there, yeah? So he didn't supervise it personally, if he never actually went to Germany. In 1852, the Book of Mormon was published in French, with Taylor and Curtis E. Bolton credited as translators. See, and they credited him as a translator, but, how good was his French? I'm just asking. I know he lived in Canada, but how good was his French? You know? Taylor supervised the translation, which was carried out by Bolton Bertrand Lazare Aug and a Mr. Wilhelm. Taylor later served as president of the Eastern States Mission based in New York City. In this capacity, he published a newspaper that presented the position of the Latter-day Saints. Yeah. Cool. Utah economic development. While serving as mission president in France, Taylor was directed by Church President Brigham Young to prepare and to establish a sugar industry in Utah Territory. This was done under the auspices of the Deseret Manufacturing Company. Taylor purchased sugar-making equipment in Liverpool while returning to the United States. These early attempts to produce sugar in Utah proved unsuccessful. Yeah, they tried for years. It was rough. Like, I didn't realize that sugar making was so complicated, that not only do you need specialized equipment, but you have to have somebody who really knows what they're doing in order to use it properly. Like, most things you can learn pretty quickly, but that just wasn't one of them. All right, Taylor is reported to have had a marvelous singing voice. At the request of Hiram Smith, he twice sang the song "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief" in Carthage jail just before the Smith brothers' murders. Taylor wrote the lyrics to several hymns, some of which are still used by the LDS Church. In 2005, Taylor's hymn "Joseph the Seer" was sung at the LDS Church's celebration of the 200th anniversary of Joseph Smith's birth. In 1985, English language edition of the LDS Church hymnal includes 2 hymns with lyrics by Taylor, "Go Ye Messengers of Glory" and "Go Ye Messengers of Heaven," neither of which I know by heart. So, all right, church president. Following Brigham Young's death in 1877, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles governed the church, and John Taylor is the quorum's president. Taylor became the 3rd president of the church in 1880. He chose as his counselors Joseph F. Smith and George Buchanan, the latter being the nephew of his wife Leonora. Said that. As church president, Taylor oversaw the expansion of the Salt Lake community, the further organization of the church hierarchy, the establishment of Mormon colonies in Wyoming, Colorado, and Arizona, as well as in Canada's Northwest Territories, now Alberta, and the Mexican state of Chihuahua, and the defense of plural marriage against increasing government oppositions. See, I didn't know any of that he expanded it to Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona. Like, that, I felt like they were in Arizona already, were they not? But I guess maybe it was more, like stronger at that point. Interesting. While he was church president, Taylor also established Zion's Central Board of Trade to coordinate local trade and production, which was done largely through the local stakes on a wider basis. In 1878, the Primary Association was founded by Aurelia Spencer Rogers in Farmington, Utah Territory. For a time, who we will also cover eventually. Eventually. We'll get there. For a time, the organization was placed under the direction of Relief Society General President Eliza R. Snow. In 1880, Taylor organized the church-wide adoption of the Primary Association and selected Louis V. Felt as its first general president. In October 1880, the Pearl of Great Price was canonized by the church. Taylor also oversaw the issuance of a new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. During his term as church president, the 70s Quorum was also more fully and regularly organized. He was quite busy for what a short time he was president of the church, yeah? In 1882, the United States Congress enacted the Edmunds Act, which declared polygamy to be a felony. Hundreds of Mormon men and women were arrested and imprisoned for continuing to practice plural marriage. Taylor had followed Brigham Young's teachings on polygamy and had at least 7 wives. He is known to have fathered 34 children. Yeah, that wasn't that uncommon in the presidency, in the leadership of the church at the time. Taylor moved into the Gardo house alone with his sister Agnes to avoid prosecution and to avoid showing preference to any one of his families. Well, okay, I can kind of see it, but it is kind of sad that you had to leave them all completely. However, by 1885, he and his counselors were forced to withdraw from public view to live in the underground and were frequently on the move to avoid arrest. See, that's what I thought. That's what I said, right? That he was literally in hiding. And how did they know where he was? Well, I guess that was his first thought, was to move there, but it doesn't mean that he stayed there. In 1885, during his last public sermon, Taylor remarked, "I would like to obey and place myself in subjection to every law of man." What then? Am I to disobey the law of God? Has any man a right to control my conscience or your conscience? No man has a right to do it. Yeah, that was a big deal at the time. Many viewed Mormon polygamy as religiously, socially, and politically threatening. In 1887, the U.S. Congress passed the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which abolished women's suffrage in Utah Territory, forced wives to testify against their husbands, disincorporated the LDS Church, dismantled the Perpetual Emigrating Fund Company, abolished the Nauvoo Legion, and provided that LDS church property in excess of $50,000 would be forfeited to the United States. Yeah, it was lovely, wasn't it? That's awesome. Like, it's just so irritating that they did stuff like this without any consequences afterwards. Like they should not have been allowed to do this. For 2.5 years, Taylor presided over the church from exile. During this period, some Mormon fundamentalist groups claim that he received the 1886 revelation. What? Photographs of the original document exist. It restated the permanence of the new and everlasting covenant, which these fundamentalist groups consider to be a direct reference to the practice of plural marriage. The validity of the revelations is rejected by the LDS Church, which does not consider it to be authentic, but it is used by fundamentalist groups as justification for the continued practice of polygamy. Okay, yeah, that is relevant considering they think it was written by John Taylor, but apparently it is not considered authentic. I am not familiar enough with it to express a personal opinion in one way or the other, so I will just accept the word of the experts and say it is probably not authentic. And you don't want to align yourself with some radicalist groups for any reason. Yeah, I'm just saying. It's not a good idea. Death. Taylor died on 25 July 1887 from congestive heart failure in Kaysville, Utah Territory. Taylor was buried in Salt Lake City Cemetery in the Avenue, Salt Lake City, Utah. For 2 years after his death, the church again was without a presidency. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles, with Wilford Woodruff as president of the Quorum, assumed leadership during this interim period. In April 1889, Church General Conference, the first presidency was reorganized with Wilford Woodruff as president. 6 months later, in the October General Conference, Anton H. Lund was called to fill Taylor's vacancy in the Quorum of the 12. Taylor's teachings as an apostle were the 2003 course of study. Okay, nobody cares. Yeah. As president of the church, of course he had a book written about his teachings to the prophet John Taylor. Yeah, it's fine. They all have one. Family. Taylor practiced plural marriage and was married to 8 wives. Leonora Cannon, Elizabeth Cahan, Jane Ballantyne, Mary Ann Oakley, Sophia Whitaker, Harriet Whitaker, Margaret Young, and Josephine Elizabeth Roche. He's the father of 34 children. Yeah, 2 sound like they could be sisters, Sophia and Harriet Whitaker. Yeah. And one of them is the mother of John W. Taylor, because his name was John Whitaker Taylor. Yeah. Who we've already talked about, so we won't be discussing him today. Taylor's son, John W. Taylor, there you go, continued to serve in the church and in politics and helped to shepherd Utah to statehood in 1896. Now they're talking about him. It's fine. John W. Taylor was ultimately excommunicated from the LDS Church for his opposition to the church's abandonment of plural marriage. Moving on. Okay, I've already done a whole video on him. His son, Samuel W. Taylor, became a writer and the biographer of his father and grandfather. Okay, cool. Another W, which makes me think it's also a child of one of the Whitakers, yeah. Another son, William W. Taylor, another Whitaker, maybe, served as one of the first president of the 70s. Oh yeah, and also served in the Utah Territorial Legislature. Isn't there a John H. Taylor as well? I'll have to look that up. Maybe I'm misremembering it. Taylor's wife, Margaret Young Taylor, was a member of the inaugural general presidency of what is today the church's Young Women organization. Taylor's daughter, Annie Taylor Hyde, was a leader in the Relief Society general presidency and the founder of the Daughters of Utah Pioneers. That's pretty cool, not gonna lie. So then they list the wives and when they were born. I wonder if Margaret Young was related to Brigham. Please tell me it's not his daughter. Margaret Young Taylor, 1837. Could that be one of his children? Oh, maybe. Let me just check really quick to see if... oh, no, it's not. Okay. If that's Brigham Young's daughter. No, it's not. Her parents were Ebenezer R. Young and Margaret Holden. Okay. I feel better. There we go. We can look more into her when we get into some of the other organizations. At the moment, we are going through the first presidency, and once we are through the first presidency nearly to modern day, I don't want to cross over into modern day, so I'm not going to cover anybody who's alive. But if we get up to nearly the modern day, then we can start and do Quorum of the 12 and go through the different organizations. But that's my plan. Right now I'm in First Presidency, yeah? These are all members of the First Presidency we've been talking about for like 3 months, but we will get through them all before the end of the year, for sure. Yeah, so I plan on going up to Ezra Taft Benson, I believe is the last one I'll be covering. And, yeah, we'll get there. So, I thought that you might find that interesting, and if you liked learning about John Taylor today and are looking forward to doing more of the First Presidency in the future, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.